Hello, friends. So, talking about the Cold War, and been looking forward to tell you this lesson for a while, and also next week. So, I hope you're ready for a little ride here. One question you might have is why is it called the Cold War? Lots of theories about that. The one that works for me is imagine a fight where two people don't actually fight; they just kind of diss each other and give each other the quote cold shoulder. That's the Cold War, a fight between the United States and the Soviet Union, aka Russia, in which there was no actual fighting between those two parties, but the whole world was actually involved in the fight. Um, so the Cold War is a battle between the United States and the Soviet Union that begins immediately at the end of World War II. And in some ways, it was a battle about ideas because the Soviet Union had a dictatorship and a communist form of government, by which we mean here that the government ran all the businesses in order to make things equal between workers. And the United States has a democracy and a mostly capitalist way of doing the economy, by which we mean here that there are private businesses and they compete with each other, and you can get really rich or really poor. Um, Something that's really important to notice is that democracy and dictatorship are forms of government. Capitalism and communism or socialism are forms of economy, ways of doing the economy. And these two things, dictatorship and communism, don't have to go together, nor is it necessarily true that democracy and capitalism always go together. So, for example, the United States is not entirely capitalist. We have some areas of business or of uh, oper- operations where we think the government should be in charge, like education, um, in order to make everything equal or to try to make everything equal. There are countries that have even more socialism and communism, like, for example, Sweden, where there is a vigorous democracy, but also many, many more government run operations like healthcare, college system, stuff like that. So clearly, you can have more socialism and still retain a democracy. Um, and also, there are many capitalist countries in the world which are run by a dictatorship. So these things don't have to go together in this way. And also, there are shades of gray. You can be a little capitalist, a lot capitalist, a little socialist, a lot socialist in how you run your economy. But what happens when people are fighting is that they draw lines and try to make a bigger argument out of everything than really exists. And that's what happened right after World War II. The two sides staked out extreme positions and treated everything as an extreme issue. And in a lot of ways, the argument was mostly about capitalism versus communism rather than about the form of government, as you'll see. But besides being an argument about ideas, this was also an argument about power. In this cartoon, you see the president, then a president of the United States, Truman, and Stalin carving up the world. And that is literally what happened. Both of them were competing for power and trying to be the dominant power in the world. And a lot of this is driven by fear. They were each afraid of destruction from each other. The more power the other one had, the more one was afraid, the more power they needed to acquire to beat back that thing that they feared. And so fear drives an increased desire for power and control. And so before the Cold War, when it was World War II, the United States and the Soviet Union were allies. And this is a picture of the Yalta Conference that took place in 1944. And you have here the president of the United States at that time, FDR, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, and Stalin and Winston Churchill, the prime minister of Britain. And they met and talked about how they were going to organize the end of the war and how they were going to manage all of the countries in the world that would be without a government or an economy because they had been invaded by the Axis powers and then liberated by the Allies. So here you have a picture of them as allies. It was never, a happy alliance entirely, but FDR and Stalin got along pretty well. And they reached an agreement at this conference that whenever either of them or any of them successfully took back a country like Greece or Turkey or any country that was Poland that was being retaken, that they would hold it on behalf of the people in that country for a while, take care of that country, and then sponsor elections so that the people in that country could choose the form of government and economy that they wanted to have going forward. So that was the Yalta plan. It got a little complicated, and you can start to notice that they didn't trust each other very much when you think about what happened, what they agreed about Germany. They expected at this point that the Soviet Union would invade Germany from the east, and the US and Britain and the French government in exile would invade Germany from the west. And they agreed to split Germany and to split control over Germany. Can you see that they're maybe a little worried about not letting one or the other have too much power? They further agreed to split the city of Berlin, which you can see here that Berlin is inside the area that they expected the Soviet Union to invade and control. But because it's the capital of Germany, they couldn't agree to allow the Soviet Union to have all the power in the capital. So they further agreed to divide the capital city, this is like a blow up of Berlin, into two halves. Half of that city would become controlled by the Soviet Union, and half of it would be controlled by the US, France, and Britain working together. So already they didn't trust each other in how things were going to go down in Germany, and that lets you a little vision of what's about to happen. So here we have the picture you've seen before of the end of the war in Europe, the Soviet soldier shaking hands with a US soldier at the river border between the two occupied zones. And this, happy moment represents the moment when Germany surrendered and the war in Europe was over. Something that's in the kind of the background of this picture is that the Soviet troops the Soviet people made a vastly bigger sacrifice than the United States did. Less than 500,000 Americans died in World War II compared to 24 million Russians. So I did the math. That's 57 times more suffering that the Soviet Union had than the United States in World War II. So even though we were acting like equal partners, in fact, we were less than equal partners. So this is what's called the Brandenburg Gate in Berlin, the capital city of Germany. And here you see a Soviet soldier controlling traffic at this place, which became the border line between the Soviet-occupied side of the city and the US, Britain, France occupied, the Allies side of Berlin. And then it was time for another meeting, this time at Potsdam, which is in Germany. And you can see that the players have changed a little bit. Franklin Delano Roosevelt died before the war ended, and his vice president, Harry Truman, became the president of the United States. So here he is shaking hands with Stalin and Churchill. Everybody looks happy. You would think they should be happy because the war is over. Behind the scenes, this was a very antagonistic meeting, and this meeting represented the beginning of a war between the United States and the Soviet Union. What went on behind the scenes is that Truman announced to Stalin that the United States was the first country of the Allies to develop a nuclear weapon, and that we intended to use it in Japan, and that was perceived by Stalin as a threat. And then Stalin announced, you know what? All those countries that we've invaded, like Poland, taken back from the Germans, I know we said we would have elections there, but we're not going to. We're just going to retain control over all of those areas and keep them in our circle of influence. We don't have any intention of giving up control. And so that was obviously a threat to the United States, and the war was on. Churchill, observing this exchange, went home and spoke to the people of the world from the British Parliament and said, "An iron curtain has descended over Europe, separating the East from the West. There is no actual Iron Curtain. He's talking in a metaphor here, but what he literally meant is that there was a line now through Europe that divided the part of Europe that was occupied by the Soviet Union's troops and the part of Europe that was occupied by the United States and Britain. And that because of Stalin's declaration that he intended not to release control, all of these countries would become part of the Soviet sphere of operation, and he feared dictatorships with communist governments. And the rest of the free world, he said, would be contained to the western half of Europe. So you can see that the battle of ideas has begun here, but also that this is a very real situation on the ground. The line is real, the line is maintained by real soldiers, and nothing could be done about that. The fear, though, was that a lot of these countries in the western side of Europe were a mess, completely destroyed by the war. People were poor and hungry, and refugees were everywhere. And so, what happens if you let all those folks have elections? Are they going to choose a capitalist economy, or are they going to choose to have a greater degree of socialism or communism? In this cartoon, you can see Harry Truman, the president of the United States, and Stalin, the dictator of the Soviet Union. And they're each sort of trying to recruit these European refugees who are here with their luggage all messed up. Maybe this person is a victim of the Holocaust who's still wearing their prison outfit from the camps. They represent the nations of Europe who are struggling after the war. And each side is trying to recruit them into their hotel. So what was the US? Hotel represents liberty and freedom, words that we have used to stand in for capitalism. Debatable whether you can really say that, but that's what we say. And over here you have the pension russe. So this is a little bit of a joke. Pension is a French word for hotel, but it also refers to a pension, which is a guaranteed income after you retire. So one of the advantages that the communist side had to talk about is the idea of a guaranteed income, and that probably sounded pretty good if you were a refugee with nothing. So you can see that the fear that the cartoonist has is that the pressure of Stalin, you can see his hand on the people's backside here, but also the message of a guaranteed income might be influential even in the western side of Europe, and what would happen then? So the United States came up with this plan called the Marshall Plan after the United States general who had it, that they would give money to European nations on the western side to help them get started in their economy, and in this way discourage people from turning to socialism. So this is a US cartoon. You can see that the US cartoonist isn't exactly thrilled about this plan, but the basic idea is that, having a capitalist economy is like riding a bicycle. And I don't know if you've ever taught anyone how to ride a bicycle, but you can, you hold on to them, you kind of push them along, hold them up until they get it, and then they can kind of ride off on their own. So here's the American taxpayers trying to teach Europe how to ride capitalism bicycle again and hoping that they will eventually support themselves. The cartoonist maybe isn't sure that's actually going to happen, but that was the US view of what we were trying to do. This is a cartoon from the Soviet Union, and you can see that people there had a different sense of what we were trying to do. Instead of thinking of it as help riding a bicycle, they're pointing out that it's weapons that we're giving people. That was true sometimes. And then this object here is a yoke. The part of a horse's saddle and other things that holds them onto a cart so that they can pull the cart. And so the yoke is a symbol of the animal's imprisonment, of the way that we hold animals and make them work. And here we have General Marshall of the United States handing out yokes and guns. And so the Soviet Union is saying, oh, that looks like money and help, but actually it's just tying you to the US wagon and with the threat of violence. The tension between the United States and the Soviet Union got even worse when the Chinese Revolution happened in 1949, because the Chinese Revolution led to a communist dictatorship in China, and the U.S. began to feel that they were going to lose control of the whole world, that everyone would end up being communist, and the U.S. would be isolated. So the Marshall Plan wasn't enough. It was necessary to step up in the effort to stop communism in its tracks. And Truman came up with this plan that he called containment. Think of it as like putting communism in a box and containing it. Here's a US cartoon about how containment worked in Greece. So Greece was supposed to have an election. The United States had liberated them from the Germans, and they were to have an election to decide who would run the Greek government after the US troops left. There were a lot of folks who were interested in the idea of creating a more socialist kind of economy. The Communist Party in Greece was having some success. And so the United States stepped in. And in the US point of view, in this cartoon, you see the United States acting as a kind of neutral party, trying to keep the communists and the non-communists from getting into a fight so that the election can be fair. But you'll also notice that while they're having this fight, the real Greece, according to the cartoonist, is just being stepped on. And the US soldier's boot is directly in her gut. So it wasn't exactly a gentle and neutral behavior on the part of the US. In fact, what we did was we gave weapons to the non-communist side and encouraged them to contain the election through force, as well as just by being popular in the vote. Here you have the Soviet view of the Truman Plan for Greece. These folks are in Greek traditional costumes, and they're being chased away by the United States, which is shooting bullets made of money. So in the Soviet view, the United States was forcing the Greek people not to vote communist, and an argument could be made that that is true. Either way, is what happened. So that gives you a little idea of how things were playing out around Europe, but I want to focus in on Germany for a minute. This division between West Germany and East Germany became permanent when the Soviet Union announced that they had no intention of leaving East Germany. They set up what's called a satellite or puppet government that was completely beholden to the Soviet Union. And the only thing that the Soviet Union didn't control in East Germany was that little tiny piece of the capital city of Berlin that was controlled by US troops per the Yalta Agreement. So this was just a big thorn in Stalin's side. He wanted to have all of East Germany to himself, and he came up with this plan to surround the city of Berlin, turn off the electricity and water to the western side of the city, and starve the U.S. troops out of Berlin. It's one city in a giant global economy. We could have just walked away, but the United States decided to dig in its heels and fight, and this led to this blockade led to what the U.S. calls the Berlin airlift. So the United States flew planes, taking off every 3 minutes from bases in Europe and Turkey, and brought food to the people of West Berlin for almost a year, an incredibly expensive and difficult operation that was just designed to keep West Berlin from caving in and becoming part of the Soviet sphere. After a year, Stalin gave up and allowed the trains to move through Soviet territory and into the western side of the city of Berlin. But that left the city in a situation where half the city was controlled by the US and half the city was controlled by the Soviet Union. This is what's called Checkpoint Charlie, one of the borders between the two sides of the city. Imagine if Albany was divided along the line of Solano, and you had to go through a military border with tanks and everything to get across to the other side. that's how things were for years and years in Berlin. But it's a city, so this border is kind of porous. There are other streets, there are buildings you can walk through to get to the other side. It wasn't too hard for people to leave the Soviet side and come to the US side. And since the economy wasn't doing so great on the Soviet side, and the U.S. side the U.S. was pumping money into the Western side, that did happen. So eventually, the Soviet Union got frustrated and built a wall through the city to prevent this kind of escape by citizens of East Germany into West Germany. The wall initially wasn't perfect, but they added a second layer to the wall. Armed guards were posted, barbed wire, all kinds of devices. And then eventually they bricked up the windows of all the apartment buildings along that line in the city. Again, picture Solano Avenue being turned into a wall and all the buildings being bricked up. And this is a famous picture of a woman who escaped from the East German side to the West German side by climbing through the apartment building and jumping out a window. Luckily, there were firefighters here to catch her. So that's the story of the city of Berlin. But around the globe, there was a whole alignment of who's going to be on what side. And if you're going to have a fight like this, you need a club of supporters to back you up. The United States built their club and named it NATO, the Northern Atlantic Treaty Organization. And NATO consisted of the United States and Canada, the western half of Europe, and a few other allies. So the idea was this is a military alliance between all these countries, specifically to control and contain the Soviet Union. We agree, and we still agree, as part of our NATO alliance, to defend any of these countries against now Russia. If you're going to have one side making a club, the other side's got to make a club. This is a meeting of the Soviet Union and all of their satellite states in the eastern side of Europe to form what was called the Warsaw Pact, an alliance named after the city where it was signed, the city of Warsaw in Poland. So the Warsaw Pact consisted of the Soviet Union with all of its additional areas that it added during the war, and then the satellite states, which looked like they had their own government, but which in fact were completely under the control of the Soviet government: East Germany, Poland, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, Romania, Bulgaria, and so on. Things got even more tense when 1953, the Russians blew up their first atom bomb in a test demonstrating that they had nuclear technology. Not to be outdone, the United States made a test of a new kind of nuclear technology called a hydrogen bomb. This is the Bikini Atoll, a chain of islands in the Pacific where we tested the hydrogen bomb. There are still places in the Bikini Atoll that human beings cannot go because of the havoc that was wreaked on the people of the Bikini Atoll by our testing. But the point is that each side now has nuclear weapons, and so they literally can't get into a war. It simply wouldn't be safe, because if they did, it would involve use of nuclear technology, and scientists pretty quickly became aware that too many nuclear bombs going off would actually be destructive to the entire global environment and cause the end of farming and the economy as we know it. So this cartoon represents the sort of tension of that they now having the capacity now to end the world. There's pressure on both the US and the Soviet Union not to actually get into a nuclear war. Many students said, oh, nuclear weapons are not allowed now. That's actually not true. There's no international ban on using nuclear weapons per se. What keeps the world from using nuclear weapons is a kind of unwritten understanding between nations. And the idea is called mutually assured destruction. So think about it like this. if I have nuclear weapons and you have nuclear weapons, and I know that if I send my nuclear weapons over to you, to your country to attack your country, before my weapons can even arrive, that you will also send your nuclear weapons over to my country, then I know that if I start a fight with you, you will destroy me. I may destroy you, but you will also destroy me. So there's no point in starting a fight, so nothing happens. That's the theory of mutually assured destruction. And the acronym MAD, if that sounds crazy to you, that's because it is kind of crazy. But crazy as it is, so far, we haven't had a nuclear war. The risk here is that if one side ends up with more powerful weapons, then that could unbalance the situation. So the other side has to build even more and more powerful weapons to match the power. So that leads to this situation here. The United States began to rapidly build up the number and size of nuclear weapons that we had until at our peak, we had 32,000 plus nuclear warheads. Just think about it. How many nuclear bombs do you need to destroy Russia? 20? 100? Certainly not 32,000. This is more weapons than anybody needs. But our fear was that the Soviet Union had more than we did. So we built and built and built and built. In reality, we didn't know how much they had. We only knew how much they threatened to have. So what you see here is the Soviet Union trying to guess how many we have and building up and building up and building up and actually overshooting and ending up with over 40,000 nuclear warheads. When I was in high school, this is what we were thinking about most of the time, was the fact that we were pretty sure that the entire world would be ended by a nuclear war at any moment. Luckily, just around the end of the time I was in high school, the two nations started to negotiate, and they agreed to nuclear arms reductions, to reducing the stockpiles of nuclear weapons to the point that we have in the modern times. These are agreements to reduce the stockpile. They are not deals to stop war at all from happening at all. And they do not reduce the nuclear stockpile below what would be possible to destroy the world. But they do make us a little bit safer. The problem is recently we've begun to abandon some of these agreements. So the little bit of good news during this time, one thing that was positive was the formation of the United Nations. The United Nations was designed to be better than the old League of Nations. The idea was to commit the world to peace. And this is the symbol of the United Nations, and the color of the United Nations is important to know. What you see here is the olive branch, which is the story from the story in the Bible about Noah's Ark, where the dove brings an olive branch as an offering of peace from God. So the olive branch surrounding the whole world, the idea of peace around the world. And so the United Nations is a member organization, and all of the members meet and they discuss ways to make peace. The United Nations is better than the League of Nations in that it has an actual army to enforce peace wherever that can be agreed upon. So when you see military folks with this light blue helmet, those are peacekeeping troops from the United Nations. The trick here is that the decisions about where to do this kind of peacekeeping activity are made in the UN Security Council, which does not include every nation in the world. It only includes 11 members, and 5 countries have a permanent seat on the Security Council. And those 5 countries, take a look at them: France, Britain, the United States, China, and the Soviet Union. These are the winners of World War II, who gave themselves the power to control the United Nations decisions. And each one of them has the right to block any decision with their own single vote. So each one of them can block any decision. The result of this is that the Security Council rarely agrees to enforce peace anywhere that these countries don't want that to happen. And since obviously the US and Soviet Union and China are frequently disagreeing with each other about things, the United Nations is only able to enforce the peace in a very limited range of places and situations. And the rest of the time, the United Nations has no power because these countries keep it from having that authority. So good news, bad news. Another good news is that theoretically, the Cold War ended in 91. It began with the arms treaties that I mentioned that were signed by the last president of the Soviet Union, Mikhail Gorbachev, and uh, the United States President Ronald Reagan, reducing the amount of nuclear weapons and taking the world out of a nuclear arms race. And then the Soviet Union itself fell apart. Gorbachev helped to disassemble it, and it became just Russia. And many of the countries in the Soviet Union got independence of one sort or another. And finally, the wall. This is a picture of the wall in Berlin. The wall in Berlin was torn down. The East German government fell apart, and the West German government embraced the entire nation of Germany, which is a situation we're in today. In fact, Angela Merkel, the Prime Minister of Germany, is an East German who grew up in Soviet-controlled East Germany. So this is the recent history of Germany, is that the nation was reunited. And what you see is the famous party on the wall when the people from both sides came together. You might ask whether the Cold War really is over, though. As you know, the United States and China still have or do have a very difficult relationship. And maybe it's a good thing that our president is such great friends with Putin, and maybe it's not. And more practically, the United States has stepped out of its agreements to limit the use and proliferation of nuclear weapons, so that we are now building what Donald Trump calls his super duper weapon, and increasing our supply of nuclear weapons at a really rapid pace. And so is the Soviet Union, and so is China. And so maybe we never really did end the Cold War, at least in that respect. And that is what the article that I have put in the lesson is all about, in case you're interested in current nuclear politics. So next week, we're going to talk about how this war that was going on in Europe actually affected every country in the world. And we'll tour around the world and talk about a whole bunch of different countries and things that happened. So I'm looking forward to talking to you then. Until then, be well.